Welcome to the Criminology Chats, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of crime, justice, and everything in between. I'm JR, an adjunct instructor in the Criminal Justice and Forensic Psychology departments at the Chicago School. I have years of experience and understanding of the complexities of criminal behavior.
And I am Emma, a criminology student at the Chicago School, eager to explore the fascinating field of criminology alongside you. The criminology program at the Chicago School is for students who are enthusiastic about true crime and helping others. In this program, students learn about criminal motivations and victimization from instructors with real-world experience working in criminal justice and behavioral health as federal criminal investigators, profilers, police officers, probation and parole officers, victim advocates, and behavioral health clinicians. The Chicago School emphasizes an immersive approach to learning focused on developing professionals who can address the present challenges and anticipate future needs. You can find out more about our school by going to thechicagoschool.edu.
In each episode of this podcast, we will unpack case studies, discuss the latest research, and interview experts to shed light on the ever-evolving landscape of crime and justice.
Whether you're a student, a professional in the field, or just someone intrigued by the mysteries of crime, we have something for you. So grab your headphones, get comfortable, and join us as we explore the intricate world of criminology. This is Criminology Chats, where we bring the classroom to your ears. Today we are chatting about an interesting case, that of Joseph or Joe Michael Ervin. A couple years ago, police in Denver, Colorado announced they solved a 40-year murder cold case and determined that each victim died at the hands of Ervin. Ervin took the lives of 4 women between 1979 and 1981 in Denver, Colorado. At this time, the cases had no link because they seemed to have nothing in common. They did not know each other and differed in age, race, and appearance. Ervin was never a suspect in any of them. Shortly after the 4th murder, Ervin shot and killed a police officer during a traffic stop. He later took his own life while in jail.
How was the truth uncovered? It took years of old school police work and a cutting-edge investigative technique called forensic genetic genealogy, or FGG. It took the combined efforts of law enforcement in Colorado and Texas, along with the support from the Bureau of Justice Assistance, that's BJA, which provided grants to help crack the case. And it took the efforts of Detective Kari Johnson of the Denver Police Department and Traci Carlson, a forensic scientist too with the Denver Crime Lab. They are here today to talk about the case.
I'm Detective Kari Johnson. I have been with the Denver Police Department since September of 1997 was when I was hired. And I did, my required stint in patrol for about 8 years, taught at the academy, did part of our transitioning from paper reporting into computerized reporting. And then I was promoted to detective in 2014. I was on our night shift investigations unit for a couple of years and then came to cold case, which since 2002, all of my evaluations, they always ask the question, what do you want to be when you grow up in your evaluations? And I always just said cold case was my ultimate goal. I didn't come into this job wanting to be a homicide detective or a sex assault detective. And then I became a cold case detective. And so now I do both. So that was in 2016. And I've been in the cold case unit ever since.
Yeah, and then I'm Traci Carlson. I'm a forensic scientist too at the Denver Crime Lab. And I've been in Denver at the lab about 6 years. I'm a Colorado native, but prior to that, I was down in New Mexico with their state lab system, doing the same stuff in their DNA and serology unit. And then prior to that, I had been actually out in Virginia. I was doing a visiting scientist program with the FBI lab, so doing research more. And then prior to that, I was in California. That's where I went to grad school at UC Davis and then was working in private industry out there. But yeah, so I've been back in Denver 6 years. At the lab, we don't have kind of specified in DNA, we don't have like specializations as far as specifically what you work on. So I work on all types of cases, but cold cases I also just like because I feel like it's kind of a last shot for a lot of them. And we get to do, as techniques update, we get to kind of go back to things and relook at them. So I like being able to help on those.
And I would say on that note, we're super lucky in Denver in that we do have our own crime lab. And so we don't outsource the majority of our testing. We get to keep in-house. And then there are very like it's a big crime lab and there's a lot of employees, but we're very lucky in cold case that they seem to have almost a cold case team in the crime lab as well. So all of these cases that we work together. And so it's not, when people say, oh, you solved, well, no, I didn't, or she didn't, or Texas didn't. It's a huge team effort. And we just consider them part of our team, and the district attorneys as well. And so we all work together all the time, which I think we're super lucky to have that advantage.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that it's important that everybody work together, so.
Yeah, we're lucky for sure.
Emma, you can pipe in at any time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess we can lead into how did you guys get involved with this case in particular?
Sure. So I think it's important to talk a little bit about the history of the victims. So we know Joe Ervin had multiple victims, but how I came about really is like on the tail end of a lot. I know that one of your questions was like, what traditional police work did I do? And I think it's important to recognize that a lot of traditional police work was done before, which really led us to this place. So Madeline Leviday was killed in December of 1978. And all of the cases that Joe Ervin, we know for a fact Joe Ervin is guilty of committing, were DNA cases. And they've all been reviewed over the years by a multitude of different detectives. And so along those lines, DNA samples would be submitted and profiles would be developed. And in 2010, an unknown male DNA profile was developed on Madeline Leviday's case, and that was entered into CODIS. And then Dolores Barajas is his second known victim. She was killed in August of 1980. And same thing, reviewed multiple times. A DNA profile is developed and submitted to CODIS. And it was in, I believe, 2013 that we got our first case-to-case match in CODIS. So the profile from Madeline's case, or Dolores's case, matched Madeline's case. And then Gwendolyn Harris is our third known victim. She died in December of 1980. And it was in December of 2015 that a profile that was obtained from a used condom that was lying next to her hand at the crime scene, that was entered into CODIS. And in 2015, we got our third case-to-case match. So now we know we have these three cases. In 2018, I was assigned to the cases after we got a fourth CODIS match. And that was from Adams County, is a jurisdiction that is just a little bit north of us. And they had a 17-year-old female victim from February of 1981. And that's Antoinette Parks. And in 2018, we got that fourth case-to-case match. Wow. And then that's when I was assigned to those cases.
Yeah, and I guess just to add to similarly, at the lab in 2012 was kind of when we really started our cold case project and we became grant funded. So unfortunately, like any government job, like funding is always tight. So a lot of these cold cases have been specifically worked under federal grants. And in 2012, we did a really large review of the cold cases that existed in our jurisdiction and identified about 1,000, about 750 were cold case homicides and about 250 were those cold case sex assaults. And so the lab started kind of doing rework because, again, technology has improved so much and changed. Back when a lot of these cases happened, DNA typing wasn't a thing yet. So it was like looking at blood typing or antibody testing, which was only ever exclusionary. That could never fully include someone. So our people at the lab did reviews of those cases. And then in conjunction, like working with detectives over here at BPD, we were able to kind of revisit these cases. For me specifically, since I was only hired in 2018, my colleague had already kind of kicked off this genealogy route because we knew we had these 4 cases connected. And, it had been almost 40 years at that point and there were no CODIS leads generated. So Stacy actually brought to our upper management the idea to pursue genealogy on this. And she initially did genealogy on an unknown homicide victim who she was able to successfully identify to kind of show that, yes, like we can do this, even though we're not genealogists. And it was kind of after she did that, I was just, sent her an email, sent my supervisor an email. I was like, hey, I want to help with this. So, and I got assigned it.
And can you explain a little bit in layman terms, what that forensic genetic genealogy is?
Yeah, definitely. So all it is it's a hybrid technique taking DNA testing and combining it with kind of the traditional research methods that all genealogists use. So your typical genealogist that is doing their own family history, or people that are helping adoptees identify their birth parents, they're using these same techniques. So we're just adopting those. So it's using public records to identify births, deaths, marriages, where people might have lived, and then building back those family relationships. It's kind of doing, again, it's very similar to someone that's trying to identify an adoptee, but almost in reverse. So you have your unknown DNA sequence that's either attributed to like an unknown homicide victim or a possible suspect in these cold cases. And you have that sequenced, which is a different type of DNA testing than we can do at the lab. And you upload it to databases that allow for law enforcement searches, and you get lists of people that are potential family members to that unknown person. So then with those potential family members, you're doing the genealogy for those people to find your connection.
Got it. So obviously, based on what you explained there, that does take a little bit of time.
Yes.
Yes.
It doesn't happen like you see on TV.
No. And I think that's really important to note is that Traci in particular, and with a lot of patience and a lot of disappointments, really worked, what was it, 3 years?
Like
2.5 years?
Year and a half building the trees, and then the follow-up, I think, took.
Yeah. So a year and a half of just, combined with all of our other tasks at the lab, that this isn't something I don't think she got to work on full time. They don't happen fast. You're right. It's, if we could solve crimes in the 50 minutes they're allotted on TV, like we wouldn't have any unsolved murders.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
And this
One of my other questions, sorry, go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
Yeah, you go.
One of my other questions was along the same lines of what are some of the common misconceptions that people have surrounding cold cases and the investigations that go behind them?
Yeah, I think the biggest one that we probably all would testify as one of the biggest misconceptions is the idea that every single cold case can be solved with DNA. And while we might have DNA in some of those cases, it may or may not be sufficient. Genealogy is very specific in that it requires unique amount of DNA in order to be sent to that sequencing that Traci was just talking about. And so while we might have a profile in CODIS, that requirement is a different level, if I understand it correctly, is a different level than it is to sequence a profile in order to conduct genetic genealogy on. And so I think, it's hard for these families when they see the news stories over and over again about cases being solved using genealogy, DNA, and then they call and we take a look at the case and we just say that's not applicable to your case. So that's, I think, one of the biggest misconceptions. And then I think the other one is just what Jerry just hit on. They take a lot of time. We don't have the advantage as a cold case detective of learning this information in real time. So we are going back and studying everything that not only the original detectives did, but also any detective that has reviewed the case and done some work on it. Then we're meeting with the lab. Then we're talking to the district attorneys. Then we're trying to take all of these new techniques that we have available to us today and seeing if they can be applied to the case. And so it's a long process. I would say that all of the cases that I've ever worked as a cold case detective, easily a minimum of a year before we're in a place where we're moving that ball forward on some of these cases.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think also I think maybe sometimes people think these cases are forgotten, and, just because it's not headline news anymore, like there are people in all aspects of the process. So again, even our DAs too, that care about these cases and remember cases that haven't been able to be prosecuted yet or haven't been closed yet. So they're always like on everyone's mind, even if it maybe doesn't seem like it. It seems like you're only pursuing current cases.
That's great. That's a good point.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the cold case, the people that are working on the cold cases, they aren't doing this full time. Is that correct? Like this isn't their sole focus of their position?
So in Denver, we're lucky that we have a full-time cold case unit, and that's all I get to do. That's an advantage, I think, to a larger agency, but you would be correct in saying that with a lot of smaller agencies, they just don't have the time or the resources. And in large part, CBI, so like the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, they have their own cold case unit because other jurisdictions don't have, your smaller police departments don't have the homicide experience because they don't get them. Unfortunately, as we all know, in big cities, there's just more people, which just equates to more homicides, which equates to more experience for a detective. So there are agencies out there that offer assistance to smaller jurisdictions that otherwise probably don't even have full-time homicide detectives. So again, we're lucky, but you see declines and increases in that. I think at one point in Denver, there were 8 cold case detectives full-time. We have 3 and a sergeant.
Grants, when it comes to some of this, the federal government, is that Bureau of Justice, BJA? And of course, you have to get grants from them probably because it takes a lot of money probably to do some of this
Yes.
testing and sequencing, I'm assuming, and things of that nature. So if you don't have that in your city budget or crime lab budget to do that, and it takes up a lot of that money on the cold cases, you need to find other revenue sources to help with that, and those grants can make that happen then, correct?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, we're very lucky that we have been very successful at getting those grants because, with how we have to spend money to sequence these profiles, that would not be in a city budget.
Okay.
Or actually, with these first 5 genealogy cases, we actually got funding from the Crime Stoppers, the local Crime Stoppers. So they provided our money initially for the funding for this sequencing. So
you don't have to be exact, but just in a ballpark figure to do a sequencing, say like those 5 cases Crime Stoppers paid for. Just a general idea, what are we looking at there? I think people don't understand that it does take money to do that. It's not something you just do for free.
Yeah. And of course, prices have changed. I believe initially we were given, I want to say $5,000 from Crime Stoppers, and that was just specifically for the sequencing of 5 different cases. Okay. And at the time, to upload to the certain law enforcement like genealogy databases that we're allowed to use, one of them was free at the time. Now nothing is free. So it's probably at least $2,000 for sequencing and upload to the various databases we need. And then and then that's not counting then the work that we'll need to go into.
Correct. Right. Yeah.
But I think I would follow up, and I don't know if you'll be able to talk to Dr. Williamson or not, but another sort of misunderstanding in the cold case world is families might call an agency and say, hey, I don't, what about my loved one's case? And they might hear, well, we don't have the money to work cold cases. I think it's really important to emphasize that funding is available out there. The DOJ, BJA, they're very focused on helping people try to fund to solve cold case investigations. But outside of that, they're like Crime Stoppers is a phenomenal example of people who are willing to provide money. There's smaller private companies out there. I think I can't remember the gentleman's name or the company name, but there's a man who had a family member who was killed, and he started a company specifically designed for smaller agencies to submit requests for funding. And like you can, how on like Amazon, you can say, I want to contribute a certain amount of money to a certain organization, or they get a kickback from that. Like he's on that. He's on Amazon. Like you can put kickbacks into his company. So, researching funding is probably the first step. I think if any agency is questioning, or any district attorney's office or crime lab is questioning, like, how can we do these things? Just doing that research, and especially reaching out to the BJA, because they're constantly offering different types of funding. And I would say that, while we got the grant to solve cases using genetic genealogy, we also tapped into a SAKI grant, because our grant did not allow for us to pay to exhume a body. And because Joe Ervin was deceased, we had to exhume him. Texas had a sex assault kit initiative grant that, because our cases are sexually motivated homicides, Dr. Williamson was able to say, well, those 2 grants can be combined. And Texas actually paid to exhume. They covered all the costs for the exhumation on Joe Ervin.
Yeah. Can you talk just a little bit about the kind of how that happened, if you don't mind?
Sure. So
nothing was easy.
Right.
But, when you look back on it, you just think that makes talking about these cases seem, the hard work that gets put into it by a lot of different people. So as Traci said, a year and a half building this family tree. Some of the more traditional stuff that I did was she would give me some names of people to try to go interview, get DNA from, to see if we could sort of, in her words, like, can we cut this branch of the tree off, or do we include this branch of the tree? And unfortunately, all of those just took us nowhere. And so they collectively had a conversation at the crime lab and decided they would reach out to what what Traci was able to determine was literally 90% of this family line came out of Texas.
Yeah.
And so they came up with the idea of reaching out to Texas and asking the Texas,
Their crime lab, so their state DNA index system.
asking them to do a familial search, which we sent them all the things we had done to say, like, this is sort of our last shot. They agreed to it. And that resulted in them calling us with a match to a gentleman, a familial match to a gentleman who is in prison down there for homicide.
Who we had in the tree.
Yeah. You tell the story. You tell this part of the story better.
I think first I'll just give a brief overview on what the familial search is. So one of our requirements under our grant was, so we had to basically have exhausted the traditional methods that DNA labs try to use to identify suspects, meaning our sample had to be searched in CODIS. And then certain states allow for what's called familial searches in CODIS based on the idea that crime kind of runs in families. So people, like, if their parents committed crimes, there's a decent chance they might go down that path. So I think only 11 states allow for it, but actually the Denver lab, we kind of designed a software to do this searching. So we had to have done a familial search in our Colorado database already to say, hey, does this unidentified person possibly have a family member already in CODIS that we could use to identify them? And that answer was no for Colorado. Texas, thankfully, is another state that allows for familial searching. So yes, like Kari said, we got to the point where, like, all of our matches were really in such a specific area of Texas, and we weren't getting anywhere more farther with the tree. So we reached out to the Texas DNA lab, their state system, to explain, like, look, these are our cases. This is all the work we've done. We have everyone we have matches to is in Texas. Would you be willing to familial search our sample? And they said yes, but they had back ordered supplies. So they're like, it's going to be a while. And so in the meantime, I kept kind of working, and I had gotten down to this family in the tree again that we had 5 brothers, the Ervins. And I was like, we're missing something. It's gotta be somewhere in here. And then I think it was like the week after I had kind of arrived back at this family, we got the call from Texas, and they scheduled a Zoom meeting, and there were 11 of us on the call. So it was Detective Johnson, our cold case sergeant at the time, me and my lab supervisor and another lab colleague, and then all of the Texas state DNA index people. And then, Trampus Gooding, Texas Ranger. So all of these people. So when that happened, we knew, we're like, okay, this has to be good news. And in the family of the 5 sons I had, we knew one of them was in prison in Texas because he had been convicted of murdering his wife. The murder happened in the mid 80s because we actually thought maybe he would be a good suspect for our case at the time. But he, I think in 2014, finally got convicted of that crime. But so we know he's in their Texas state system. So we were so hoping they'd tell us his name, and they did. And so we were like, oh, this is amazing. It's got to be one of his brothers. 2 of them had Colorado connections. One only fit kind of the timeline. But then apparently in Texas, when you enter prison, you kind of fill out a little comment card on your family history.
Dead or alive.
Yeah, dead or alive. And so he listed out his parents, who we knew. I'm like, yep, got those people in the tree. He listed his sisters, who we knew had those people in the family tree. He listed these 4 brothers. I'm like, yep, check, check, check. We have those in the family tree. And then he listed another brother that we did not have in our family tree. And it was, Kari will say more about this, but oh my gosh, he had aliases. He had died in 1981, and his information had been scrubbed from various police databases. So there were many reasons that we weren't going to identify him through what we were trying to do. So it was because of his brother self-reporting this unknown person to us that once you have a name, you're able to, find information on him. So
obviously that brother being Joe Ervin. Yeah. So once we found that information out, and it's still in that Zoom meeting, literally and all of this is during COVID. So, we're all doing this my phone just starts dinging, and it's Traci. And she's like, I found a residential address for Joe Ervin. It's in Denver. And that happened to be literally, like, as the crow flies, a 5-minute walk from where we found one of our victims, where Gwendolyn Harris was found deceased. She found a marriage record here in Colorado. And then it just was like this explosion of information. But that's, the thing about genetic genealogy is it's just another tool in law enforcement's toolbox. And so you have to go back and do more of your traditional criminal history. What do we know about this guy? Was he even Colorado at the time? Because he was so connected to Denver. And what she also found was a death index record indicating only I think it was just the month and the year that he had died.
And the county. Did it have the county?
It didn't have the county.
Oh, okay.
It just had the month. We didn't even know what state he died in. And then she couldn't find anything else. No obituaries, nothing. So I took a guess because I think his marriage certificate was 1978 in Colorado. So I just took a gander and reached out to our vital statistics and said, hey, can you tell me if there's a death record for this individual? And they came back with yes. And it was actually under one of his alias names, Joe Ervin, ING instead of Ervin. And then that told us that he died in Arapahoe County, Colorado. No, yeah. Adams County? Adams County. Thanks. I was like, where was he?
Yeah.
And that the manner of death was suicide. And so because we had Antoinette Park's case out of Adams County and I had a connection with a detective up there, I called him and I said, listen, you're probably not going to have a suicide report from 1981, but will you look? And he's like, we're not going to have it, but I'll try. And he called me back an hour later and he's like, I hope you're sitting down because not only do we have it, it's 20 pages long. And the reason he was incarcerated, and this is when we first heard this news, the reason he was in the Adams County jail to begin with was because he had shot and killed Aurora police officer Deborah Sucor in the line of duty. That was on June 27th of 1981. And then I think he committed suicide like July 1st, like 4 days later. So reached out to Aurora Police Department. We got those records from her homicide. That's when we found out he had a 1969 homicide warrant out of Texas. That's when we found out that. So then I'm like, well, why is he not in NCIC? Why am I getting no criminal records? We also found out from Aurora's records, he had been arrested in 1970 in Denver for a series of burglary sex assaults in March of 1970. He subsequently goes to he pleads not guilty by reason of insanity. He goes to the Colorado State Mental Hospital for 7 years and still nothing. Like there's no criminal history. There's no criminal records. Well, what we learned was that it was a practice of both like state and federal agencies that if someone's 10 print card is sent to them from a medical examiner's office, they wipe those records. I don't think that's the practice anymore. They've realized that that's important information for us to have, but that's why we couldn't find anything on Joe Ervin. So,
and then from my side of things, because he had died in 1981, when I was using things like obituaries to try to shore up family relationships, both his parents died after him, but neither of their obituaries had a preceded in death section, so he was not listed. And then another resource is called Find a Grave, where people just go and they kind of document grave markers for family lineages, and people can associate family lines on those. Joe was not listed on any Find a Grave sites. There were his parents and then two brothers that had actually preceded him in death. But so Joe was nowhere to be found there, and that was because his grave was unmarked. So back to the exhumation and part of the complications.
So we figure out obviously from his death certificate where he's buried. So then we reach back out to Texas and ask for their help. Ultimately, it's a long story, but ultimately I author the search warrant. Well, let me backtrack. So that's when we realized that our grant doesn't allow for the exhumation cost. And we looked at all of these brothers and we were like, well, yes, it could be any of these other brothers except for the one that's in prison, but everything tells us like he's the best one to start with. So we know he's in Denver in that time. We know where he's living at that time. So ultimately, we combine those grants. Texas Rangers, I can't speak highly enough of them. They're phenomenal. Trampus Gooding connects us to, he's now Captain Jason Bobo. He was a lieutenant back then, who then connects us to Ranger Travis Denby. I write a search warrant up here. We send it down to Texas. Ultimately, that's signed by a judge. My sergeant and I fly down. The Rangers handled everything, getting the exhumation put together. We also we're lucky enough in Denver to have an ATF agent embedded in the Denver homicide unit. And he flew down with us just to be there to assist us with whatever we needed. He actually brought, we're going for an exhumation, right? He's been buried since 1981. We're bringing back bone samples. So Ryan actually brought a empty carry-on thinking that we're going to bring back bone samples. We go down there, the exhumation just goes smoothly. First, we think then Lieutenant Bobo was like, okay, we've identified where he is. He spoke to the people at the cemetery. We get out there, we start digging, and we're just digging, and we're digging, and we're digging, and we're still digging. And then they're like, he's not here. And your heart just sort of stops a little bit. You're like, okay, let's regroup. And so then they move closer to where one of his brothers is buried, and they start digging there, and they're digging, and they're digging, and then they hit rock. They're like, clearly he's not buried underneath the rock. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we're in the wrong cemetery. It's just got to be something like that, right? So ultimately there's a little huddle amongst cemetery staff and Lieutenant Bobo, and then they come back and they're like, no, he's buried behind his brother, not next to his brother. So the third time's a charm. There is a person buried there. But in my mind, of course, I'm like, this is bad. This is probably the wrong guy. We would probably just exhume some poor innocent fellow. But everything fit together. And even to the point of having some characteristics, physical characteristics of the remains that we could still see that corresponded with what was in the autopsy report, including the fact that he had a silver front tooth, and then the type of cut that was made in the top of his skull during the autopsy was consistent with what we saw at the scene. So we go through all of that, and we end up bringing just 5 small containers of bone sample back. And I'm not bringing bones back in this carry-on suitcase. And so that's how that happened. And then my job is done at that point, and I turn all of that over to the crime lab, and they do their work.
And you made the identification then that it matched with the unknown.
Yep.
That was not easy either, though.
It was not easy. Bone samples are not something we have to process super commonly. So it's a multi-day extraction method. And then because he had died and been formally buried, he had been embalmed. And embalming fluid does something called cross-linking to DNA. So it just breaks it down. So it was incredibly hard to get a good enough DNA profile that we could do kind of our comparison and be confident in the identification. We had to do multiple rounds of lab work for it.
And also, I'd like to ask Kari there, how did the families of the victims, once you knew he was the perpetrator, and you then, I'm assuming, informed some of the remaining family members of the victims that you in fact identified the person that killed their loved one, what were the reactions of the family members? Okay, both sides too, of Ervin's side, if there were any that, and then on the victim side.
Sure. So on the victim side, I think it's important to recognize that not only did we have the deceased victims that had family members that still needed to be contacted, but we collectively with the district attorney's office really felt it was important that his surviving victims didn't get the shock of their lifetime in seeing his face on the news. And so we sort of broke that communication up between the two of us. So the district attorney's office actually reached out to and spoke to the surviving victims from 1970. And they were all exceptionally grateful to not have that, see that shock on TV. In fact, one woman said that Joe Ervin when he was arrested for killing Deborah Sue Core, the surviving victim had seen his face on the news and had fainted. And so that was back in 1981. And so just hearing that story really drove home, right? They're still his victims, and they do still fall under the Victims' Rights Act. And so that drove home for us how important it was to make sure we communicated with all of Joe Ervin's surviving victims that we were able to. And then communicating with the deceased victims' families, I took that on. And I will say that every single family member was grateful. There was some shock. There were families who were like, we didn't even know these were still on the radar, much less that you've now solved it. And one family was so excited, they went straight to the media. And then there was another family who was like, we're super grateful, but we're not really sure we want any media exposure. And it was sort of fun to watch them grow into, no, we want our mom's story to be told. We want that information out, that these cases can still be solved, and this person was ultimately held responsible. But I think that the biggest lesson, and I'm glad that I had conversations with our victim advocates unit first. That's another team that's really important, I think, for people, investigators, district attorneys, crime labs. Anytime you're working with victims' families, I think having VAs on board is really important, because our VA sort of educated me that not everybody is going to have the same reaction. Like all of us think this is amazing. We've been able to solve these crimes, but there might be people out there who they've moved on and they've closed that chapter of their life, and bringing that back up to them might be really difficult. And of course, my initial internal response to that was like, no, they're going to be so grateful. It's going to be so amazing. And she was spot on. There was one family who, again, very grateful, but asked for anonymity. I can never say that word. They didn't want to be involved in any type of press conference and asked us to be very minimal in the information that we shared about their mom. So it was the gamut of emotions, I think, from those deceased victims' families. And then as far as Mr. Ervin's family, Joe Ervin's family, I sort of took a cautious approach to that. And I think could I do it over again, I would certainly reach out to at least a sibling. I chose to speak only to his still living wife, and her reaction was very, I think, understandable, shocked. Of course, she knew that he had been arrested for killing a law enforcement officer because they were married in 1981, but she had no idea about his past as far as the arrests in 1970, the 1969 warrant. And she had no inkling at all that he could be this horrible person. He was a husband, he was a father. And then I think as far as, conversations that she and I have had subsequently, like that's just for her privacy, I'd like to keep that, just between her and I. But I would say that her response, which I would imagine the rest of the family's response would probably just be shock.
And she was provided with the victim advocate context as well, because that's, I think, one of the harder parts of this is like, yes, we're bringing closure to victims, but then you're also, completely changing someone else's life, someone they cared about too, not knowing this history about them.
Yeah.
Okay. And did when you got the file from the Aurora police, were you able to read the suicide note that he left?
So he actually left a series of small little notes. There were some apologies to Officer Core. And when he shot and killed Officer Core, there was a young man who was driving by who tried to stop and assist her. He was also shot and injured. So there was an apology there. There were some cryptic things in there where he talks about not being able to control himself, having done bad things, but there's no, direct confession to any of the crimes that he committed.
Okay.
Is the investigation on him closed and shut, or is there suspicion that he might be involved with any other unsolved crime?
So, we've talked about this, and I think it still comes up a lot too, because we think that if there were any other unsolved sexually motivated homicides, we really think that DNA would be in the system. It's possible that we have victims where no DNA was able to be collected, and so we may never know if he's responsible for other sexually motivated deaths. I do believe that there are possibly other living sex assault victims out there that, again, maybe they didn't report, maybe they did report, but no DNA was collected because it was, in the 70s and 80s. So I would say someone like Joe Ervin, I don't think you could ever close the door to the idea that he's responsible for other crimes. We just don't know what they are.
And another thing I'd like to ask you about too, and this is questions for both of you, is I believe based on what you all described that the police on the initial cases, the initial deaths, must have done a pretty good job at the crime scene collection, preservation of evidence, obviously, because I date myself when I say that I was actually a special agent in 1979, 1980 and 81. And so I know myself, as far as collecting evidence within the federal system, that we were very big on collecting, preserving evidence, but not all police departments at that time understood the need to collect and save the stuff. So I want to maybe make a comment, either both of you or one of you, on how well that happened, or it didn't happen well in maybe some of those particular murder cases that you were able to link together. So talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think we agree that, and I've said this, and Traci and I have done some other presentations on this, and I think it's really important to emphasize the fact that, in 1978, DNA was not a thing. 1980, DNA was not a thing. Again, Traci spoke about the blood typing and what they could and couldn't do with it back then. So that the detectives, that they collected the quantity of evidence that was available to them, I think is phenomenal. That it was preserved in our property bureau for this long is phenomenal. I will stand for these cases in particular, and in a lot of cold cases that get solved, right? We can't solve these cases if the job that was done ahead of us was done poorly. That's another sort of going back to the question of, what are some misunderstandings about cold cases? Sometimes the best job that could have been done, maybe it wasn't done. But these detectives in these 4 cases, the 3 Denver cases and the Adams County case, they did phenomenal jobs. And they are the reason these cases got solved today because of what they started. We were able to finish it.
And I want to add, because one of my favorite stories for the detective team, he recently retired, but Detective Marty Smith, he had been involved in these cases at one point. And it was because of him that the lab went back and reworked Dolores Barajas' case, and that was because he was looking at old crime scene photos, because initially that case was not thought to be a sexual assault. They thought it was a homicide. The area it happened in, there had been burglaries going on, or robberies rather, like armed robberies. So they thought perhaps it was murder only connected to that because she had been dressed with her blouse open. But Marty went back and looked at those crime scene photos and saw that her underwear band was slightly raised above her pant line. And to him, that was an indication that she had been redressed. And so he was like, we need to have this examined as a sexual assault. So it was then that the lab examined her underwear and was able to identify that male DNA profile that then matched to Madeline. And then similarly too with Gwendolyn, there were various DNA samples tested in her case. There was initially a condom sample that actually hit to vaginal swab that hit to a different suspect in a different homicide investigation. And so, but then someone reviewing that saw that this condom had never been tested and requested that be tested. So then the lab goes back and tests that, and that's what hits to Dolores and Madeline. And then to speak a little to Adams County, because we didn't do that work, I think her case, I believe, had a kit collected at the autopsy that initially had testing done, but they didn't actually have any samples left from that case. What was left was just a tube that either the vaginal swab had been stored in or a previous extract. And so an analyst there went back and just swabbed that tube and only got a very partial profile. But it was that work then that allowed that 4th case connection to happen.
Wow.
So yeah, exactly what Kari said. The work before us definitely invaluable.
That's good. Yeah, I remember back in the day, back then, they could tell you secretor, non-secretor. And
Yep, that was it.
Yeah, which probably, in fairness, right, probably sort of dictated what you did or didn't collect. And you see that, right, as times change and science changes and capabilities change, crime scene evidence collection changes.
Yes. Yep. That's very good. So definitely a team effort, obviously.
100%.
Then through.
All the way. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, Emma, you got a few more questions, I bet. No? Yes?
Yeah. Just thinking about the amount of police work that went into the crimes originally, why do you think that they didn't link any of the victims, specifically the ones in Colorado?
It's hard. They're all very different. Maybe that goes to another misconception that people always have a specific victim type. These women ran the gamut of age and race, and they were kind of downtown-ish Denver, but it wasn't like they were all found in the same area. So I can't speak to police.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point, because when we look at serial killers and victimology, you do see that there's a lot of similarities. And I would imagine, there's nothing in these case files that indicate that they looked in that direction for each of these victims. But, Madeline Leviday was a 33-year-old white female stay-at-home mother of 2 young children. Dolores Barajas I think she was 57. She was a Hispanic female. She was not a full-time Colorado resident, so she was only here in the summers. Madeline's killed at home. Dolores is killed walking to work one morning. And then Gwendolyn is a 27-year-old African-American female. And Antoinette's a 17-year-old African-American female. They all live in very different places. Antoinette actually lived in Aurora, Colorado. They all have very different lives and different family types. And so I don't know that I could speak to why, if that is in fact why they weren't connected. I think the biggest thing is that they did all look different. Like Dolores is sort of our middle victim for the Denver victims, and she initially did not look like a sexual assault victim. And I would even say that Gwendolyn, our third victim, didn't, because she's found fully dressed. Her skirt is pulled up around her waist, but she's wearing pantyhose. And so she also may not have looked like a sexual assault victim, which then goes back to the question of, the police work that was done in 1980 around Gwendolyn was they collected that condom, even though she's fully dressed. So I think the limitations of the type of evidence and being able to connect those is probably the biggest factor in not being able to link them together initially.
Were there any hairs or fibers in those 4 cases that were preserved as evidence or anything that could indicate at least what's the word I'm looking for? Being it African American versus Caucasian versus non-Caucasian, or other
Sure.
races?
I do know Madeline, yes. There were hairs that were recovered from the bedding that she was found on that they identified then to an African American. I don't believe in Dolores. I don't think any of the others had hair collection. But also the unique thing about Madeline's case was that the oldest of her 2 daughters was, I think, 3 at the time, and very articulate for a 3-year-old and well-spoken, and was able to say that, in her exact words, a Black man came to the door and gave mommy a rash. So there's single-handedly the only eyewitness in any of these 4 cases was the 3-year-old.
Okay. Forensic genealogy going? Do you see it becoming more widely used? And what are some of the barriers, I think, that are preventing it from being used in the way that it really could be?
Yeah, no, that is a really good question. I think kind of the biggest thing will be what legislation gets developed around it, because people really do view it as
an invasion of privacy. And that's why we really try to advocate for, there are the genealogy databases that do in their user agreements indicate that they allow law enforcement searches. And there are 2. And those users have the choice to opt in or opt out of that search. So it's not even everyone in those databases is just agreeing to this. But if agencies don't follow those rules, because part of it is we're identified as law enforcement kits when we're submitting to those databases. So if people aren't following those rules or using databases that don't allow that per their user agreement, that's going to really hinder the use of the technique. So it really will depend on what legislation kind of comes out about it. But also it ultimately could be finite. Currently, it's mainly used for cold cases. The case in Idaho about the students murdered there, that they did use genealogy for that one. That's, I think, the only current case I'm really aware of that had this technique used. So in cases where it's an active risk to public safety, it might become a little more common. But I don't know. I see this continually being like a last resort, just because of how much time and money it takes to successfully do it. And we want to hope that our more traditional methods will continue to be successful. So,
yeah, I think that, go ahead. Sorry.
And one thing that I wanted to ask is, we did mention CODIS, and there may be some listeners out there that don't really understand what that is. So real quick, could you just give a quick down and dirty of what CODIS is? And so for listeners that don't understand what that term is.
Totally. Yes. So CODIS stands for Combined DNA Index System, and it is run by the FBI. So forensic labs that are what's called accredited, meaning we are meeting certain standards set both by the FBI and international agencies to be able to do DNA testing. Those are the labs that have access to be able to upload DNA profiles into CODIS. And so what it's used for is DNA profiles that are developed from crime scenes. If the DNA is believed to be attributed to a perpetrator, that gets uploaded into CODIS. And there are different indices within CODIS. So there's different levels. There's the national DNA index system, the state DNA index system, and then local DNA index systems. And they all have different requirements about what can be uploaded to those databases. And then there's also offender indexes. So when people are convicted of crimes, a DNA sample is submitted.
Not all crimes.
Yeah, not all. Sorry, yeah,
certain crimes.
yeah, convicted of felonies. They are that their DNA profile is uploaded to CODIS, and then certain states are what are called arrestee states. Colorado, again, is one of those. So if you're arrested and charged with a felony, your DNA can be collected at that time as well. So then we have this offender index and then the forensic index, which is again crime scene evidence, and those are searched against each other to try to make associations. There's also a separate missing persons index. So if we have unidentified remains or people that say, hello, my I haven't heard from my relative, I think they're missing, then their DNA can be uploaded into that index to possibly identify an unknown victim.
Might be happening or could potentially happen in the genetic genealogy world. And I think one of the hindrances that is very common but often unspoken is sort of public perception. And I think that's key for listeners to understand that, when we submit our unknown DNA profiles to these databases, we don't get everything back about these matches. So we're not getting their medical information. We're not getting their family history. And, we're getting sort of a generalized where in the world their genealogy, like their DNA came from, whether it's European or South American or, Native American in origin. But I think public perception out there is that when we're submitting to these databases, we're getting every little bit of you back. And we're not. We're literally just getting the names on your match list. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important that the public understand we're very limited, in particular, in what we can get back. And maybe that would ease the angst that some people have about submitting to these two companies that allow us, and that's
Family Tree DNA and
GEDmatch. And then opting in and saying, yes, you can search my DNA, and being comforted in knowing that all we're getting back is a list of names. That's all we're getting. Because I do think that hinders people's willingness to submit and allow law enforcement to search.
In the same line of questioning, could maybe you explain to the listeners why solving cold cases is so important for someone that maybe question why so much work is putting into these cases, especially in this case where the defendant was deceased and he's not active in the community?
Yeah, I think it's easy to say there's so many bad things happening in the world today. Why are we looking back on what happened, even 10, 15, 20 years ago, much less 40 years ago? And I think the bottom line for us as investigators and scientists and the district attorney's office is that a violent crime is a violent crime. And there's a potential that offender is still out there and may potentially still be active. We don't know if they're alive. We don't know if they're in prison. We don't know what factors in their lives could have changed. And when you think about some of the other serial killers that are so well known, they sort of absorbed themselves into mainstream society. They stopped committing crimes and they had families, but that doesn't make them any less guilty of the crimes that they did commit. And as family members today, you have a homicide victim today, that family wants answers and they want justice. That doesn't change. In fact, that probably only increases for victims' families as the years go by. And to be able to bring living suspect to justice is our goal. It doesn't matter the age of the crime. It's our goal to bring them to justice. We didn't know that Joe Ervin was specifically our suspect in this case until we were able to exhume and test his bone samples. So it's possible that he had a living relative that could have been responsible for these cases that then could have been brought to justice. But it's our job to determine that for a fact. And so I think it's important that the public understand that we don't give up. We're not sitting on our laurels just waiting for information to come in. We're actively investigating and actively reviewing and actively working in the crime lab to try to bring these families answers. And I think I do think there's a public perception out there that we just don't care. And I think being able to solve cases like this and bring that information to the public helps people understand victims' families and victims, right? Cold cases encompass old sexual assaults as well. Those victims are still living. I think it's important that they know from a public viewpoint, whether it's a news story or a podcast, that we do still care and that we are still, as a team, actively working these cases.
Yeah, definitely just ditto what Kari said, like the people matter. And even if, there's only one
relative left, like they deserve to know that their loved one was cared about. And so to be able to help provide answers is really rewarding.
So maybe on a final note, I don't know if we're ready to wrap it up here, but just maybe explain what it feels like for both of you to close a cold case.
Oh gosh,
You go first.
yeah, this one, our roles are very different. As part of the lab, our role definitely is to be a more unbiased entity. And so I really don't have contact with victim families or anything like that. We analyze the samples, we do our reports, provide investigative leads or not, depending on the case. And our role, because we can also do defense testing. So our role is meant to just look at the evidence, examine it, and report what is there. But with this case, I actually did get the opportunity to meet Madeline's daughters and some of the brothers of Antoinette Parks. And yeah, that was really incredible because to see what it meant to them was pretty overwhelming and not an experience I get to have. And then also this had just been so much work for so long. So it also felt a little like, what do I do now? There's plenty, don't worry. But yeah, I don't know. It was kind of a weird day when we finally realized like, okay, we're not going to be talking about this and thinking about this every week for the next year kind of thing. So.
Well, and I think she underplays their role a little bit. You know, Traci came on board with these cases in 2019.
Yeah.
One of the supervisors in the crime lab has been there for a significant amount of time, and he's seen, he's worked some of the lab end of things prior to Traci coming on board. And then we have one of our district attorneys who, even before I came on board, was, looking at these cases and working these cases. And so I do think the importance of the team is that we, like Traci said, they don't normally get that experience. Working cold cases, they don't normally get brought in on our like cold case presentations to the DA to like, hey, this is why I think we can make this arrest. And so I think she underplays how important they are and probably how those feelings are. They're probably a lot more than we think, right? Like, I think when you can look at your work, and I'm speaking from someone who sees Traci at her job, she puts so much heart into her job. And all the crime lab people that I know, and especially the ones in our cold case group, I mean, their hearts are in it and they know these cases. They don't just know the science of these cases. They know the victims' backstories and they know the family stories. And so having them be a part of this team is super important for us. And our appreciation of them just goes so deep. And it's fun to be able to let them it's fun to have them in that process of solving these cases and bringing them to a closure because their work is so important to doing that. And I think, from my perspective, and I think a lot of people could say this about the crime lab too. Everyone's like, this is like a case of a lifetime. But every case we have, I think, is a case of a lifetime. And so she's right when she says that bringing this to a close, you do sort of go, oh my gosh, what next? Because it becomes so absorbing when you're so close to that finish line and you're trying to dot all your I's and cross all your T's, and those stumbling blocks keep getting put in front of you, and speed bumps and failures in some things, flying to Texas thinking we're going to go interview someone who is going to be able to give us a suspect. And then she's like, I don't know, don't even know those people. You have the disappointments so that when you finally get the answer and you can definitively say Joe Ervin is your suspect, you have this like super emotional high of we've done this collectively as a team and we're bringing these answers to these families. But then you just sort of have that letdown of, wow, like what next? And I think the question, what next, is not meant to imply, oh, that's over, that's done, we don't think about that anymore. It's exciting to be like, what do we get to do next? Because look at what we've done here. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
I think that's probably a good way to end our podcast today.
Well, thank you guys so much. If I could, Jerry, you did your plug. If I could, I just really want to make sure that people know how grateful we are to the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Affairs, Dr. Angela Williamson. She is an absolute amazing advocate for solving cold cases and staying up on what's current and what they're able to do through funding. So I want to make sure that we are giving them the shout out for providing the funding. Of course, Crime Stoppers here locally in Colorado, the Texas Rangers, the Texas Crime Lab, like all of those people deserve acknowledgement and thanks, I think, beyond anything that we'll ever be able to really
Yeah.
express.
Absolutely.
We'll make sure we keep that part in.
And to you guys, thank you for wanting to tell this story and wanting to put this out to probably listeners we don't even think about. You know, I guess I was pleasantly surprised of, let's put this out on a higher education level. You know, we're used to presenting to investigators and crime labs and district attorneys. And so I think we were both really pleasantly surprised. We've actually done a presentation for just community members through the University of Denver. And so that there are educational facilities out there that also are invested in telling these stories. That's a whole different generation of people that are being communicated with through your podcast. So thank you guys so much for wanting to tell this story.
Emma and I thank both Detective Kari Johnson of the Denver Police Department and Traci Carlson of the Denver Crime Lab for taking time to chat with us about this case. Both Kari and Traci wanted to provide our listeners and students with their contact information, which is listed on our website at criminologychats.podbean.com. Traci's email is Traci, Traci, Carlson, Carlson, at denvergov, denvergov.org. Kari's email is Kari, that's Kari, Johnson, Johnson, at denvergov, denvergov.org. Also, Traci and Kari wanted us to make sure that we gave a shout out to Dr. Angela Williamson, the supervisor of the forensic unit at the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of Justice Programs, Bureau of Justice Assistance, and liaison to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. Without her and her knowledge and support regarding grant monies, this case could have never been solved. To you by the Chicago School. We thank the students at the Chicago School for being part of it. The podcast is produced and edited by A.M. Peters and has received post services from Audio Photo Synthesis. The opinions or points of view expressed in these recordings represent those of the speakers and not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the Chicago School. Any commercial products or manufacturers discussed in this episode are presented for informational purposes only and obviously do not constitute a product, approval, or endorsement by the Chicago School or any of the speakers on this episode. Thanks again for listening. Hope you'll listen to our next episode. Have a great day.